Gurdjieff was born on the 13th of January 1866 in Alexandropol. His father was Greek and his mother Armenian. His family intended him for the priesthood, and he was prepared for that with the help of his father and the teachers that he had in adolescence. Gurdjieff's first teacher was Dean Borch from the Kars military cathedral, which had recently been taken over by the Russian Orthodox Church. In his writing entitled The Material Question, Gurdjieff tells his audience that he is, quote, the very man who has sacrificed almost his whole personal life to this vital question of education. He points out the methods of teaching by his father and his first teacher. His father told extraordinary tales, with the result that George Ivanovich imagined that he did everything in quite a special way. Learning how to learn, and to learn quickly, was the main principle. Due to this ability, learned in his youth, Gurdjieff claims that he was able to grasp the essence of whatever information he found, instead of being left with merely an accumulation of empty rubbish, as he called it, which is the result of our method of learning by heart. His second teacher was Bogatyevsky, who had his education in the Russian Theological Seminary. Bogatyevsky joined later the monastic community in Mount Athos. Moving further south, Bogatyevsky became Father Evlisi, an assistant to the abbot of the chief monastery of the Essene Brotherhood, situated not far from the shores of the Dead Sea. Gurdjieff was, however, interested in finding answers to the unexplainable phenomena that he came across continuously. This resulted in his search for the truth that lasted approximately 30 years. The only authentic clues to where he was at that time are given by him in his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. One of the mentioned unexplainable phenomena is connected with a little-known group of people called the Yazidis and their religion. Gurdjieff witnessed how it was impossible for a young boy to break out of a ring that was drawn in the sand around him. This caused him to become interested in the Yazidis. The reason why Yazidism is so little known is that their religion is an oral tradition. There are no older texts available. The roots are near the cradle of Western civilization, whether Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or some other. References to Ahura Mazda, the Parsis, and Zoroastrianism are often mentioned. Sometimes called the devil worshippers, sometimes angel worshippers, the Yazidis live in the Kurdish area in Iraq, where their spiritual center Lalish is situated. It is commonly believed that one of the strong influences of Yazidism is Zoroastrianism, which has as its basic message the concept of good and evil. Incidents like the unexplainable phenomena of the Yazidi boy made Gurdjieff try to find explanations for them. The conclusion he came to during his studies with his friend Pogosyan was that there was a certain something which people formerly knew, but that this knowledge was now forgotten. They found some texts in ancient Armenian and got so interested in finding out what the text was all about that they went to Alexandropol to study the text further. They turned out to be letters written by one monk to another. The end of one passage spoke about the Sarmung Brotherhood. He concluded that the Sarmung Brotherhood was established by a group of people called the Aisors, the Assyrian descendants living in the Caucasus. In the Sarmung monastery he found the sacred dances of the priestesses and heard the sacred music. In his book Meetings with Remarkable Men, Gurdjieff writes, "What struck us most was the word Sarmung, which we had come across several times in a book called Merkavat. This word is the name of a famous esoteric school which, according to tradition, was founded in Babylon as far back as 2500 BC, and which was known to have existed somewhere in Mesopotamia up to the 6th century, AD, but about its further existence one could not obtain anywhere the least information. Gurdjieff uncovered a map of the Sahara before it was covered with sand. The Sahara had undergone a series of wet periods, the most recent occurring around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. It was not until 3000 BC that the Sahara transformed into its present arid state. There are some references to Egypt in Ouspensky's fragments, also known as In Search of the Miraculous, that can give us further clues to what Gurdjieff found. Ouspensky quotes Gurdjieff, "The Christian church, the Christian form of worship, was not invented by the fathers of the church. It was taken in a ready-made form from Egypt, only not from the Egypt that we know, but from one which we do not know. This Egypt was in the same place as the other, but it existed much earlier. Only small bits of it survived in historical times, and these bits have been preserved in secret, and so well that we do not even know where they have been preserved." What is the Egypt that existed much earlier than the one we know? In his studies of Egypt, John West came to the conclusion of the existence of an earlier civilization from which the Egypt we know borrowed most of what they had. This becomes evident as every aspect of Egyptian knowledge seems to have been complete at the very beginning. In other words, Egyptian civilization was not a development, it was a legacy. The conclusion John West derives from this is that the earlier civilization referred to is no other than that of the legendary Atlantis. Gurdjieff goes on telling about the schools of repetition that were taken as a model for Christian churches and adds, "The form of worship in Christian churches almost entirely represents the course of repetition of the science dealing with the universe and man. Individual prayers, hymns, responses, all had their own meaning in this repetition, as well as the holidays and all religious symbols, though their meaning has been forgotten long ago." Gurdjieff started his teaching in 1909 in Tashkent. At the age of 43, he had behind him approximately 25 years of search. The time in Tashkent was a continuation of the studies of hypnotism using guinea pigs. Gurdjieff came in contact with a vast number of people involved in what he called the psychosis of occultism and theosophism, spiritualism, and became an expert and guide in evoking phenomena of the beyond in a very large circle. In the beginning of the third year, he acquired a solid authority among the members of 3 such independent workshops. He then decided to give them all up and undertake the organization of his own circle on quite new principles. This was not teaching at all. Experimenting may be the right word, perhaps helping some people and entertaining with tricks. It does show clearly that the beginning is always hard. The earliest account of his time in Russia was written by an Englishman, Sir Paul Dukes, who was in the Secret Service in Moscow. Of the time in Russia, around 1915-18, we have Peter Ouspensky's masterpiece In Search of the Miraculous, which is still today the best presentation of Gurdjieff's ideas and how they were delivered. Thomas de Hartmann, the composer who composed with Gurdjieff and played the music, and his wife Olga de Hartmann give an account of this time in their book Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff. When Gurdjieff reached Moscow, and soon after also St. Petersburg, he had made an oath not to use his psychic powers for his personal benefit. This oath contained the decision to lead an artificial life for the next 21 years of his existence. The oath was made in 1911, and he wrote about it in 1932, in the year his oath ended. In the course of his 21 years of artificial life, Gurdjieff played many roles. Ouspensky describes on his first meeting an Oriental man who was poorly disguised and spoke Russian incorrectly with a strong Caucasian accent. Another role was a teacher of dancing. Ouspensky's first meeting with Gurdjieff took place in the spring of 1915. Reading In Search of the Miraculous between the lines, it is clear that a fair share of the contents did not come from group meetings, but was delivered in private conversations between Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. The book contains all the psychological and cosmological ideas. To take it as the whole teaching would be wrong. Ouspensky certainly did not follow Gurdjieff all the way. The first meeting happened as a result of various coincidences, starting from Ouspensky clipping a notice of the struggle of the magicians out of the newspaper. The ballet gave birth to the movements as we know them today. Ouspensky was not particularly interested, neither did he take part in the movements later in life when they were offered to him. Ouspensky puts his approach very clearly in one of his answers to a question in the book The Fourth Way. When you follow conscious ideas, you become more conscious. But he said also that the system cannot be learned from books. What Ouspensky was to the ideas, Thomas de Hartmann was to the music. By 1917, Gurdjieff had under his wings a brilliant writer and a high-class musician. These two different human functions, thinking and feeling, as approaches to Gurdjieff's teachings and as channels of transmitting the teaching, are two of the essential elements of the harmonious development of man. The third element in the reception and transmission is the movements. One can enter the work through any of our centers. The writings, readings, lectures appeal mainly to the thinking center, the music mainly to the emotional center, and the movements mainly to the moving center. The work itself is a combined effort to work on all three centers. This is the real definition of the Fourth Way, often wrongly interpreted as a collection of ideas which are not transmitted in a monastery. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution, and Gurdjieff had to head out into new lands and begin again. The time in Constantinople can be seen as a further development of the form the teaching would take. Gurdjieff worked with both Ouspensky on the texts and de Hartmann on the music for the struggle of the magicians. The form of the teaching was giving lectures and performing some of the dances to a restricted audience. From 1918, Ouspensky had felt that he had to go away from Gurdjieff. He writes in the fragments, "I had nothing to say against Gurdjieff's methods except that they did not suit me." He continues, "I perceived that Gurdjieff was leading us in fact towards the way of religion, of the monastery, and required the observance of all religious forms and ceremonies, but it was not my way. After a short detour in Berlin, efforts that failed to get Gurdjieff and his followers to London, he ended up in France. In just over 2 years, the teaching acquired a new taste and became open to a much wider public than in the earlier attempts. The Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man was established in 1922 in Fontainebleau-Avon, 65 kilometers from Paris, in an estate called Château du Prieuré. The pace of building up the institute was very intense, and so was the inner work that Gurdjieff conducted with an increasing number of students. A study house was built for the movements and a Turkish sauna for relaxation and cleanliness. After the visits to London, many of the former followers of Ouspensky visited the Prieuré. Among the first to arrive from England was A.R. Orage. Orage had met Ouspensky in London already in 1914, when Ouspensky was on his way back from India to Russia, and had been in correspondence with him. They met again in London, where Orage also met Gurdjieff for the first time. Orage sold his successful magazine, The New Age, and moved to the Prieuré in 1922 to follow Gurdjieff. He was a respected literary critic with many contacts in the literary circles and attracted a flow of writers to the Prieuré. One who stayed was Catherine Mansfield. In 1923, Orage was sent to New York to prepare the way for Gurdjieff's proposed voyage. He became Gurdjieff's ambassador in the United States for the next 7 years and organized the first groups outside Europe in New York. "If one thing would be different, everything would be different," said Gurdjieff. Apparently the one thing that could not be different was his interest in motor cars. After their return to the Prieuré in the fall of that year, Gurdjieff's car collided with a tree with nearly fatal consequences. The accident made a difference. Gurdjieff was in a coma and recovered slowly. He wrote later that when he first entered the Prieuré, he was confronted with Mrs. Serious Problem. He now had to decide how to continue in these circumstances. After he officially closed the institute, his decision was to begin to write books. The writing was begun at the end of 1924 and continued for the next 10 years. The first version of Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson was impossible to read. He revised it more than once to achieve what he wanted. Why did he do this? The explanation we have is that whoever reads the book and makes an effort to understand it will be able to find out the meaning. On the other hand, a mere reading will not get to the meaning at all. The idea is something like this. If you want knowledge, it is available, and to get it, you will have to pay for it, make it your own, so that you can understand. It is generally known that Gurdjieff laid his pen to rest in 1934, after he had written and published his final work, The Herald of the Coming Good, the only one of his writings that was published in his lifetime. Gurdjieff sailed to America at the end of 1933. This time he was in the US for over a year. He was interested in leaving the old world behind and settling in America, but the extensive plans to do so came to nothing. The idea of finding a home for the Institute in France or America persisted to the very end of his life, but in spite of close misses, it did not fully materialize. In 1936, Gurdjieff moved to the Rue des Colonels Renard, which became his living quarters and the meeting place for his groups until the end in 1949. Throughout the Second World War, in his apartment, Gurdjieff was looking after food supplies for his students, for the refugees that were with him, and also conducting group meetings and movements at Salle Pleyel. Gurdjieff wanted us to wake up from the trance-like hypnotic sleep we are in. To help us, he used and left behind a psychology and cosmology in his writings. At first glance, we are faced with an impossible situation. As human beings, we see no further than our nose, as Gurdjieff said. A summary of his teachings offer the following list. We are asleep and cannot wake up. We are a machine run by impulses from the outside and the inside. As a machine, we cannot be responsible for our actions. We cannot do. Everything is just done to us or happens. We have no will, only some desires which can be weaker or stronger. We are always identified with something. We do not know ourselves. We are not what we imagine we are. Buffers keep us from seeing ourselves as we are. We are full of self-love and vanity. We have only information, no knowledge or understanding. We do not know what we want and have no aim. We have no attention. We live in dreams and imagination. We do not know what the truth is and cannot tell the truth. We are full of habits and a slave to them in our surroundings. We have no permanent and indivisible I, but instead many eyes. To make the effort of waking up to a higher level of consciousness is not as easy as getting out of bed. In the first place, we do not know or sense that we are asleep. A second obstacle is that it is difficult to wake up if there are no alarm clocks or someone who is already awake to shake us. Gurdjieff's teaching is called the work because it requires a real effort that each person can make invisibly and internally. This is an inner psychological work, one that requires us to not merely know the ideas, but to apply and practice them as well. This practical application leads to personal change that opens onto a new level of knowledge that some have called knowledge through being. The ideas presented by Gurdjieff have power, the power of genuine psychological and spiritual transformation in the midst of daily life. Consciousness in the moment can put us in touch with a timeless reality, eternity in the moment. This is the goal, that great sages and saints and teachers have reached. To radiate with a higher goodness is the result of work on oneself. Those who follow these teachings reach out for that state of consciousness which makes the difference between a life well lived and one not lived at all.